Welcome. My name is Don Davis. I'm the editor-in-chief at Internet Retailer, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We'll be talking about how to use analytics effectively to maximize the results of marketing campaigns. And our two speakers are digital intelligence experts from Cardinal, a digital marketing analytics and data science company, and the sponsor of today's webinar. Our first speaker will be Nick Iyengar, whose experience includes helping major brands get the most from their analytics through deep segmentation and customization. He previously worked at Google, where he managed the analytics guru team, and he's a regular contributor to Marketing Land, and wrote about the state of digital marketing analytics for Internet Retailer's Top 500 report. And we seem to be a couple of slides behind, so we can advance the slides to Nick's slide. There we go. So that's Nick. We'll also hear from Mary Andrews, whose focus is clean data collection and measurement. She has worked with large companies involved in both business-to-business and business-to-consumer e-commerce and has experience across all aspects of data collection and measurement strategy. After Nick and Mary speak, we'll take your questions. You can ask questions at any time using the text box on the screen. And the next day or two, everyone on the call will get an email with a link to today's presentation that you can share with colleagues. And with that, I will turn the mic over to Nick Iyengar of Cardinal Path.
All right, well, thanks a lot, Don, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Excited to take you through the material that we have prepared, and hopefully leave some time at the end here for some Q&A as well. So when you all signed up for this webinar today, we asked you to tell us a bit about what your greatest challenge is when it comes to getting business insights out of all that raw data that you're collecting. And what we did was we turned that into a word cloud, and I thought it was interesting to see some of the themes that come up when we talk about what those challenges are. And so some of the things that come up here are the classics for sure, things like making sure the data is clean and accurate and trustworthy, taking all that raw data and turning it into actual knowledge and understanding, looking for integration between tools. And so we'll have quite a bit to say about addressing all of those challenges here today. So excited to get us started. You know, it's funny, a lot of times we have clients in the retail space who kind of fall into this temptation that analytics for retail is sort of easy, because you have a really well-defined sort of conversion on your website or in your mobile apps, which of course is a completed transaction. And so since that kind of endpoint or that goal is fairly clear, we tend to think that analytics might be sort of easy. We throw some tracking in the shopping cart, and we're happy when revenue goes up, and we're sad when revenue goes down, and that's kind of it. But actually, analytics for retail isn't that easy at all. There's a lot of strategy and implementation work that needs to be put into place first. And what's really helpful is when that strategy and technological work is really driven by true business objectives. And so what we want to get away from is tracking those metrics like revenue or order value or transactions from repeat buyers, or whatever the case might be, sort of in a vacuum. And instead, we want to measure these different KPIs sort of in the context of our customer journey, in the context of our business, so that when we're measuring these things and we see that important measurements are up or down, what we should do about that becomes a lot more clear, right? And so the idea that we're talking about here, and what we'll be focusing on for today's webinar, is the idea of what we call a KPI framework or a measurement framework. Now, there are lots of these frameworks out there. Things like net income or the customer life cycle are sort of classic examples, and we'll see a few examples of that as we go today. But again, the point is, by giving these KPIs some structure and some context, you're a lot better situated when it comes to identifying where your problem areas are, where your optimization opportunities are, and so forth. Now, the measurement framework is really fundamental. I mean, whether you are trying to address some technical challenges when it comes to analytics, whether you're focused on sort of the day-to-day sort of business optimizations, or whether you're trying to really approach some of the more strategic, high-level analytics goals, things that are going to help you actually sort of change the way you do business, not just kind of squeeze a few more percentage points out of your conversion rate. All of these things are really well supported and much more likely to be profitable and be efficient and be successful if you have that coherent, agreed upon, documented measurement framework in place up front. So there's a lot of stuff that we all want to do, a lot of tools that we want to play with, a lot of different types of analytics projects that we want to get involved in, and it can be really complicated even if you do have a really good, robust KPI framework in place. And so before we jump into all of the latest tools and the coolest features and all that kind of stuff, we want to make sure that we have our strategy sort of buttoned up front. And so again, that's where this measurement framework comes in. So there's a few pieces here of the measurement framework, and we're going to take you through it from beginning to end, and kind of pull the curtain back and show you how we do it. But the idea here is that by kind of getting aligned in terms of what our business objectives are, how we're going to measure progress or lack of progress, for that matter, against those objectives, thinking about kind of the key segments, the key audience groups that we're measuring. By getting aligned on all of those and being able to see all that in one place, again, we're going to have a lot of insights and a lot sort of easier path to insight as well, in terms of figuring out what are the levers that we can pull, right, to really improve our profitability. Okay, so before we jump straight in, what I'll do here just to set this up a little bit and get to know the audience a bit is we'll take a quick poll. And the question that we've got for you today is, if you're attending here this afternoon, where are you with your measurement framework? So at the organization that you're working with, some of you may not have a measurement framework at all. That's okay. Again, we're going to show you how it all works. Others of you may have a framework that's kind of like an informal framework. It's not documented, but perhaps sort of understood throughout the team. Others of you may have had a KPI framework at one time, but now it's incomplete or out of date. Maybe some of you are just looking to get some extra tips and tricks, but you have a complete measurement framework already. So we'll just leave this open for a few more moments here and give everyone a chance to have their say. All right, so let's go ahead and take a look at the results. Okay, interesting. So we've got a very sort of evenly distributed crowd here. So we've got some folks who are probably starting fresh here, don't have a measurement framework yet. Others of you have one that's kind of like an oral measurement framework. It's sort of talked about, discussed, hopefully understood throughout the organization, but perhaps not set in stone, not documented as officially as it could be. Some of you have had a framework in the past, but you're worried about it's sort of staying up to date or still being complete. And then some of you already have one, maybe just looking to get some additional tips and tricks, make sure it's as buttoned up as it could be. Okay, very good. Well, with that, let's go ahead and jump into it and just talk a bit about sort of why having a KPI framework is so important, and why at Cardinal Path we're sort of always preaching the gospel of a measurement framework. And the fact of the matter is, we all know this sort of intuitively, but actually deriving some value from all of the raw data that we're now collecting is actually really hard. It's okay to admit it, right? We all struggle with this, and it's hard to do. 10 years ago, the challenge was just getting our hands on any data in the first place, right? But for a lot of us, we've sort of gone past that issue, right? Now we have more data than we can actually handle, or what IBM here calls data explosion, right? And as a result of that, sifting through the data, figuring out what's important and what's not, bringing order to chaos is sort of difficult, and it often prevents us from deriving any value from that data that we're collecting that we really want to be an asset and a source of competitive advantage. And unfortunately, one of the results of the fact that deriving value from data is hard is that actually over time, and this is actually, I find this amazing, but over time we're actually becoming less likely to use data when it comes to marketing projects. And so the long-term trajectory here, as you can see from the CMO survey going back almost 5 years now, is at best kind of flat, but actually probably slowly negative. And I think what that shows is that we're all kind of slowly drowning in this morass of data, or that data explosion that we saw on the previous slide, and struggling to sort of claw our way out of it, and again, turn that data into an asset, something that we're using to drive performance, as opposed to something that's just kind of burdening us and weighing on us. So a KPI framework will really help with that. The other thing that we at Cardinal Path really focus on is just making sure that we have kind of a balanced, holistic approach to data and analytics. And so what you're seeing here is what we call our online analytics maturity model. And we look at, for any given organization, we look at these 6 different dimensions that you're seeing here on the screen. So that starts off with sort of management, support, and buy-in, through to things like, individual team expertise, methodology for optimization, technology at your team's disposal, et cetera, et cetera. And what you want to see, hopefully, is a nice kind of balanced investment across all 6 of these dimensions. But what we often see instead is something that looks a bit more like what you're seeing here on the left, where you have an organization that maybe has really focused and made heavy investments in things like tools and technology, but hasn't made the same investments or doesn't have the same buy-in from management, for example, doesn't have a clear, documented, agreed upon methodology for optimization. Maybe the team expertise isn't where it needs to be to actually make use of all those tools. And so what we want to do is make sure that we have a framework for growth, but that growth doesn't get sort of unbalanced, right? Where we hire a ton of talent but don't give them the tools to do their job, or overinvest in technology and don't have people who can actually use it, right? So that maturity model can really help you understand kind of where you sit and across all of these 6 different dimensions. So that's the online analytics maturity model. But let's shift gears and talk about the KPI framework. Again, this is going to be a fundamental underpinning to seeing success in almost any analytics-related project you're going to undertake, whether it's on the technical side or on the kind of pure data analysis side. The first step here is really simple, and it's just to kind of define our business objectives and get them out on the table. And this can sound really simple, it might sound really obvious as a place to start, but what's interesting from our point of view at Cardinal Path is that, while this sounds like an easy thing to do, when we do what we call stakeholder interviews, for example, and we talk to people across different teams, different silos of the organization, we talk to sales, marketing, finance, supply chain, et cetera, the business objectives that you hear about can actually be very different, right? And so getting all the cards out on the table and coming to some alignment in terms of what's really important and what's a high priority across the business, not just for any kind of one function, is really important. The other thing is that as we kick on from here, as we go forward and start to do things like define specific KPIs that are going to help us measure progress against these objectives, and as we start to do things like define audience segments that we're going to measure really closely, so those first-time buyers, repeat buyers, anonymous visitors, et cetera, we want to make sure that all of those audience segments, all of those specific KPIs are always going to ladder back up to the true high-level business objectives that we're trying to accomplish, right? So that's step 1. Get these out on the table, kind of navigate through that ambiguity, and come to some consensus around what the business is really trying to accomplish. Once we've done that, what we try to do is take all those objectives and start to organize them or group them or look at them through the lens of the customer, right? So taking sort of a customer-centric approach to this, mapping out the customer journey and figuring out like where do those business objectives really lie along the path to conversion or the customer journey or whatever you want to call it. So focusing on the customer, having a customer-centric approach to measurement is helpful in the sense that it just kind of gives you a way to humanize all this data, just for lack of a better word. But a few best practices here, obviously focus on the customer as you lay out this journey. Keep it simple, don't overthink it. We'll see some examples here in a second, but this customer journey does not need to have 42 different stages, and that's probably overkill. Make sure that you're revisiting this every so often, just making sure that it still reflects reality, reflects the nuances of your business, and keep it fresh, right? Again, don't let this be a set it and forget it kind of thing. But that said, let's take a look at what I'm getting at here. Again, step 1 was let's define those business objectives, get them all out on the table, and then see if we can kind of organize them, right? Bring some structure, bring some context using the customer's journey or the customer's experience as our framework. And so what you're seeing here is a classic customer journey framework from the initial attract phase all the way through to the conversion. And we see a lot of clients who kind of stop tracking after the conversion happens, even though there's quite a bit more that you can do. So if you kind of stop the story at the point of conversion, you miss an opportunity to do a lot of measurement around things like customer retention, customer loyalty, and even things like turning your customers into your advocates, right? Essentially doing your marketing for you. So stopping at the convert stage is a common mistake or a common missed opportunity. But as you can see here, we don't have 40 different steps in this customer journey. We've broken these down into just a handful of steps. So the interesting thing is going to be, as we start to lay these different business objectives that you're seeing here onto this framework of the customer journey, we need to be able to kind of define the specific KPIs that we're actually going to use to measure whether we're accomplishing these goals or not, right? Whether we're making progress against these goals or whether we're not. Now, the example that you're seeing here is just that. It's only an example. So if you really think that your customer journey has got 8 stages, that's completely fine. If you think you've only got really 3 that you want to focus on, that's fine too, right? So what you're seeing here is just purely an example, and hopefully, the concept is what's important here and what's making sense. A more visual way to look at the same kind of framework is through a funnel, right? So your awareness objectives are going to be kind of tied to your upper funnel types of goals, all the way down through consideration and purchase to loyalty and advocacy. So the same objectives, the same framework, perhaps just kind of an interesting or more visual way to look at it. But that's the first idea, right? We define those business objectives, come to some consensus and alignment about what we're trying to accomplish, and then use the customer's journey to actually lay those objectives out and sort of group them accordingly. Whether it's awareness through to advocacy or whether you're using something like a net income framework, that's all fine. But the idea is now we have this really nice structure that gives context and gives an organization to these objectives that otherwise might just be sort of a random grab bag. So I want to invite Mary in just to kind of talk about the value of using the customer journey itself as a framework for business objectives. This is something that we've done a lot with our clients here at Cardinal Path, and Mary, you've been on the forefront of that for any number of clients. So wanted to toss it over to you just to kind of add a bit of color to these concepts.
Well, thanks, Nick. So you've touched on so many critical items just in that first part of the conversation. I heard a couple of keywords, silos and drowning in data. And when you're faced with this, aligning the consumer journey to the business needs is your crucial first step. It helps us key in on what are the most important and meaningful data points that we need to focus on, and then we can start breaking down those silos. Because really for the business, they don't mind where the data, no one minds where the data is coming from. We just need to know that through every piece of the consumer's journey, we're able to gather the data we need to inform our business decisions. So great example with a vehicle manufacturer client that we have who has an e-commerce capability, digitally speaking. These are effectively like micro conversions, small purchases that you can make on their website for like things like t-shirts or accessories, whereas the main conversion actually happens at the dealership because you can't purchase a vehicle online. So when you think about the consumer journey, a lot of the attract and engage measurement might be happening on the digital frame. However, when we get into the ultimate conversion, the big vehicle purchase, that actually might be happening at the dealership. So putting all that together against the consumer journey and understanding that those data silos exist, that's great to know. But ultimately, we just focus in on those data points that are meaningful for the consumer. And that makes it much easier for us to align against the ultimate business questions that we want to answer. So it's a great example of where, hey, on the digital front, maybe they're engaging with a video or downloading a spec sheet, and that's something that we've seen is a digital engagement that points towards an ultimate purchase. That helps us understand the consumer and what they're exposed to, what helps move the needle. And then further, as they get beyond the purchase and they come back and they're engaging with the brand further into the loyalty and advocacy area, what information, what other engagements have they had at the dealership or with the brand in general that helps them to come back, be an enthusiast, maybe even have some repeat purchases. What's the impact of social on those purchases? We can start to look at that end-to-end funnel at the consumer level and see how it truly impacts those business questions. So a crucial first step to the measurement framework process, and I know that's a lot to cover there, but a great example there too of how data silos, we know they exist, but it doesn't matter. Let's just move forward, get the information we need, and then we can start to act. So Nick, hand it back to you.
Awesome, thanks Mary, and I'll toss it back over to you as we go here for some more kind of real-world client examples. But as you mentioned, this kind of adoption of a framework using the customer journey as a way to kind of frame up what our business objectives are. It's a really important step, but it's only one step of the process. And the next piece is to kind of push that forward, and once we've got our business objectives organized, we have to go that next step and actually figure out, okay, what are the specific measurements that we're going to take, that we're going to sort of agree up front are going to be the indicators of whether we're driving the performance that we want to see, or whether we're not driving that performance, right? And so that's where we're going to get into the specific individual KPIs or key performance indicators that we're going to use to measure our progress. So the key here is that we just don't want to have, we don't want to only look at our high-level objectives in that customer journey framework. We need to be able to have specific ways of understanding whether we're making that progress or not, right? So these metrics, these KPIs, are again going to become sort of the coin of the realm, or the currency of the organization, right? We're going to sort of try to agree upon a set of these KPIs that, again, if we see that they're moving in the right direction, we agree that means that we are achieving the kind of progress that we want to see. At the same time, we agree that if they aren't moving the direction that we want to see them go, that we have some work to do, right? That we need to kind of change course, make a U-turn, try something different until we're seeing those measurements move the way that we want to. Now, one of the things that I'll call out here as kind of a common hurdle in KPI development is kind of a too early focus on the how, I guess I would say. Worrying about how you're going to get this data before you've even worried about what you would use ideally, right? And so I know that's something that I struggle with myself, even with years and years of doing this for clients, but it's easy to kind of let your mind skip ahead to how you're going to do this. The reason why I want you all to kind of resist that temptation as best you can is that mindset of immediately letting your mind go to the how, it actually sort of limits your vision, limits your creativity, limits the ability to really get all the KPIs that you would ideally be using out on the table, right? And so if you focus only on KPIs, for example, that you already know how to produce or already know how to collect, or that you already feel confident in, there are potentially measurements that are more relevant, more actionable, more trustworthy, that you're sort of leaving off the table or not considering because you're worried about where you're going to get them, or whether you're going to need a new tool, whether you're going to need to get some training on how to use that tool, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is important to think about sort of where you'll get that data from. Again, as Mary pointed out, is it from a website? Is it from an app? Is it from a store? Is it from a dealership in that particular example? That is important to think about where it's going to come from, but worrying too much too early about how you're going to get it will kind of put a damper on things and will limit your vision for which KPIs you can use. But where you're going with this KPI development, as we go back into that kind of KPI framework that we're starting to build here, is for each stage of the customer journey that you've identified, right, and for each stage where you've started to lay across those business objectives, we want to now be able to have specific measurements, right, specific key performance indicators that, again, tell us whether we're making the kind of progress against those objectives that we want or not. And so here you can see that same example that we had from a few minutes ago. We've got the 5 stages of the journey, starting with awareness, going through consideration up to the purchase, not stopping at the purchase though, or the conversion, but also looking further and further into things like loyalty and even customer advocacy. And the idea is, right, for each of these 5 buckets or columns or whatever you want to call them, for each of these 5 categories, you've got specific KPIs that you can point to and say, these are the things I'm going to use to measure success or failure. Right? So again, you start to see the outlines here of a really nice structure that's coming together. Okay, so let's keep moving. And Mary, I want to toss it back to you because this idea of choosing the specific KPIs that you're going to use to measure progress against those objectives, again, I think the kind of thing that can sound simple at first, but we often find is a lot more complicated than you might expect once you really get into the weeds and start getting your hands dirty.
So true. It's funny when you're talking about maybe purchase as a key business objective. You would think, oh, revenue, there you go, there's a metric. That's definitely a KPI for us. And you would think that's relatively easy to define, but in fact, I recently came up with a situation with a client where revenue was not only being measured differently, but sometimes it shouldn't have been measured at all and was causing all kinds of internal confusion. So once you get your KPIs aligned against your business goals, really looking at them with like some deep specificity, almost bringing a magnifying glass to each metric and ensuring that everyone has agreement on what that metric means and what it measures is super important. In this particular case, we have a client with multiple brands, like 20 different brands, and some have an e-commerce capability where you can make a purchase online and some don't. You can add an item to your bag, but you actually check out at Amazon or Target, one of those e-retailer partners. Unfortunately, in both cases, revenue was being tracked to the website. Sometimes revenue included tax and shipping, sometimes it didn't. And so it was causing mass confusion because management, they just want to look at each brand and get, some comparatives. How's revenue doing for one brand versus another? But again, when you talk about what does that metric mean in the digital space, doesn't include tax and shipping. If you are checking out at an e-retailer, actually we can't get that data on your website. That comes from a different source. Those simple real-world examples that cause us hurdles and unforeseen complications when we're actually trying to read out the data at the end of the day. So really coming to this consensus early, defining your terms, doing this with clarity, and creating that measurement framework up front, to your point earlier, Nick, is that strategic underpinning, and then everything can grow out of that in a more seamless and a more aligned way. So yeah, just another great example, again, of why the measurement framework, it's almost like that solid foundation that you build your house on.
Exactly, and we're almost there in terms of the full process of building out this measurement framework. We've talked about defining your business objectives, getting those all out on the table, organizing them in the context of your customer journey, and then kind of drilling into those objectives, right, and identifying the specific KPIs that you want to use to measure progress against those goals. But the last piece, and I think by far the most important piece to really bring this home, and the reason why having this measurement framework is just so crucial to actually driving value from your data, to activating these audience groups that you care about, to turning your data into a source of not just frustration, right, but a source of insight, is this last piece, and it's segmentation, right? And so what we don't want to do is end up just having a really nicely organized way to do really basic reporting of here's how many page views I had this month, and here's how many completed transactions there were, and that sort of stuff. Those kind of high-level, vague, aggregate reporting schemes often struggle to be actionable, right? And that's why they struggle to be valuable. And so the key to value is taking these insights and making them much more specific. Essentially, what we're talking about here is the idea that in order to be actionable and therefore to be valuable, insights need to be really specific. In order for insights to be specific, though, we need to really apply a very robust, rigorous segmentation approach to our data. Right? So segmentation is how you go from that high-level, aggregated, sort of amorphous data, if you will, and get down to the level where, when you see that a metric is moving in a certain direction, all of a sudden it becomes really clear what you should try or what you should do to see some improvement. A key thing I'd call out here, and we'll see some examples of this in a second, but one of the areas where I think clients may struggle with segmentation in the digital space is that your segmentation scheme or your segmentation approach should be what we call MECE, right? And what that means is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive, meaning as you define these audience groups, as you break up your customer base into these different segments, your segments should cover the entire user base, right? That's the collectively exhaustive piece. But they should also avoid overlap, right? So the same customer shouldn't necessarily be in more than one segment at a time, right? And so that's the mutually exclusive piece. And having that kind of rigorous approach to segmentation really makes your data very clear. It makes the insights sort of jump off the page in a way that they don't when your segments are a bit more ad hoc or a bit more arbitrary. So let's take a look at what I mean here. Just kind of driving this forward to that last step in terms of this KPI framework. So what you're seeing now is we already had our business objectives sort of overlaid onto this customer journey of attract through to advocate. And then we've kind of translated those high-level objectives into specific actionable KPIs. And we're pushing the envelope a little bit further here now by adding a level of segmentation to those KPIs. And so let's say you're focusing in on one of your engagement or your consideration KPIs, and you notice that perhaps overall you're doing pretty well. You're up 5% this month or this quarter or this year, whatever the case might be. Without segmentation, though, it becomes very difficult to understand what, if any, sort of areas for improvement you have, which audience segments you can really activate to drive even better performance. So when you apply that segmentation, you end up with something like what you see here, right? Instead of just seeing that, hey, good news, we're up 5% overall, you're actually able to kind of take that same metric and evaluate it across any of these different audience groups that you've defined, right? And so here we have a good example of a segmentation scheme. We've got our anonymous visitors. We've got account holders, so we do sort of know who they are, right? They have a login, but they've never bought something. Then we have our one-time buyers, and we have our repeat buyers. And I like this kind of approach to segmentation because it's MECE, right? We know that every user of the site is going to fall into one of these buckets, but only one, right? And so we know that we have a comprehensive coverage of our user base here with this approach to segmentation, and we know that we've sort of accounted for everyone. The other thing is, now we have this much more specific insight, right? Maybe we're doing well overall, we're up 5% with our engage metric, but actually amongst our one-time buyers, right, we're actually down 5%. And so now I have a really clear, specific, and therefore actionable insight, right? Maybe the insight, or the action rather, is that I need to change the way that I retarget against one-time buyers. Maybe I need to alter the way that we do email marketing to these people. Maybe we should be targeting these folks with some kind of social efforts or whatever the case might be. Maybe personalizing the site for one-time buyers to have a different kind of homepage would be a way to turn that minus 5% into something more positive. But again, you now have this very obvious, very clear group of your customers that you're looking to activate to drive performance. So again, just the levers that you can pull, right, start to become a lot more clear. Okay. So again, you want to define those business objectives, lay that out across the customer journey so you have a nice customer-centric way of thinking about your objectives. You want to translate those objectives into specific KPIs, and then lay some kind of segmentation scheme over the top of those individual KPIs so that you can break them down and really understand where your areas for improvement are, what your optimization opportunities might be. So just a few steps, and that's really what the KPI framework ends up looking like. So you can imagine that this multiplies out across a lot more KPIs that you probably care about and that you want to track day to day and week to week. You may have more than one way of segmenting your audience, right? This is just one way, but again, clearly highlighting where those areas for improvement are and giving you a really good jumping off point for optimizing performance. So with that, let me just talk about what some of the next steps are. Once you have a KPI framework or a measurement framework in place, kind of where can you go next, right? And what are the different things that you can do? So in terms of next steps, I mean, like I said, ideally we would treat this as the fundamental sort of jumping off point for anything that you want to do in analytics, but an obvious use case here is the technical implementation. And so I can't tell you how many times we work with a client that's actually already done their implementation, right? So they've already got their web analytics in place, they've already got social listening in place, they've already got testing and optimization in place, whatever the case might be, and then we realize that there actually is no measurement framework. And what that means is that the way that the tools are configured and installed has very little to do with the actual business objectives. Any kind of connection back to key corporate priorities is merely sort of coincidental. So what we want to do is hopefully have the technical implementation of tools, whether it's web analytics tools or anything else, actually driven by those same business objectives that we're measuring with those KPIs and breaking down with those segments, right? So all that technical work should be guided by strategy as opposed to getting done up front and then you worry about what your strategy is. The other thing is, back on the analysis side, again, virtually any kind of analysis project that you're going to do with your digital data, we really hope would be underpinned by this measurement framework. A lot of different things that you can do here, different directions you can go. A few ones that I'd call out just as being, the really obvious candidates are things like data visualization, right? So building dashboards can be a big challenge for the organization. A lot of reasons why dashboards get built and then just collect dust and don't get used. but making sure that your data visualization program, whichever dashboarding tool you end up using, right, making sure that those visualizations that you're building for your stakeholders, again, ladder up through those segments and through those KPIs to your actual business objectives is a great way to make sure that they stay relevant and therefore get used. Another obvious one is for those of you that are thinking about things like A/B testing, multivariate testing on your site or in your apps for that matter, personalizing the experience for different audience segments. Again, those are pretty complicated programs to get up and running, and having that clear North Star of what you're measuring, what you're optimizing for, and why really helps you see a lot more value and a lot faster value as you start to get those kinds of programs off the ground. And so we could go on, but really anything that you're going to do on the analysis and optimization side really benefits from having this KPI framework in place. So with that, I'll just kind of transition into a few different kind of tips for getting started. This can sound like a lot of work, and I won't lie, I mean, it certainly can be, right? Especially in an environment where you have multiple brands or multiple geographies, multiple product lines, and these kind of things. It can turn into a lot of work, and that's okay. That shouldn't sort of intimidate you and stop you from jumping in. If you're thinking about, how do I tackle this without, biting off more than I can chew, right? How do I approach this in a way where I can clearly show some progress and start to get some value from it? A few things you can do, right? First, prioritize, right? It's okay to focus in on just the most important parts of that customer journey. Start there and then expand as you go and as you start to have some wins. Think about what the low-hanging fruit is, right? So where are those quick wins for those really high-value audience segments that you have? How do you put together some really robust, rigorous measurement around just those specific audience groups, right? Find out what those optimization opportunities are, execute on those, and then kind of expand the scope of your measurement framework from there. Another important one is as you think about sort of the technical aspects of this and where is this data going to come from and do you have the tools at your disposal that you're going to need. I encourage you and exhort you even, leverage the existing platforms and tools that you have every chance you get. If you find yourself kind of ripping out old tools and reinstalling new ones, that may be appropriate, right? And there certainly might be a time for that, but that will certainly set you back from a timeline point of view, right? And this KPI framework should really be tool agnostic, right? It shouldn't depend on the tools in your toolkit. It should be driven by your business objectives. And so leverage your existing data, leverage your existing tools, and that'll help you kind of get a good sort of working version 1 of your authoritative measurement framework in place and something that you can start to use. And lastly, again, this is not something where if you don't do it all at once, it isn't worth doing. In fact, quite the opposite, right? Again, prioritize the most important parts of that customer journey, right? It's absolutely something that you can sort of build one building block at a time. So if you find that this is a pretty aggressive project to take on, don't feel like it isn't worth doing at all. Instead, just prioritize the pieces that you can do that are realistic and that you feel are sort of most likely to be tied to the most important audience groups, the most important customer segments, the most important parts of their journey. So again, just to wrap it up here, hopefully we're driving home the point of why these measurement frameworks are so important and so valuable. But I just leave you with this. Again, whether it's technical projects, whether it's the day-to-day kind of business optimization, or whether it's the true kind of strategic initiatives that you're trying to underpin with analytics, all of these things are going to be a lot more likely to show you ROI, to be successful, and just to get done in a more realistic time frame, to be honest, if you're measuring all these things and guiding all of this work with, again, that documented, rigorous, agreed-upon measurement framework. So with that, I think we'll leave it there in terms of the prepared remarks, and we'll take it over to the Q&A time. So Don, I'll toss it back over to you, and looking forward to seeing what kinds of questions we get from the audience.
Okay, well, thank you, Nick. Thanks, Mary. Give everybody a lot to think about. So as the members of the audience think about how they're going to do what you've just described, I'm sure they'll come up with some more questions. We already have some in the queue, but still time to add your questions. Just want to remind everyone that you'll all be getting an email with a link to today's presentation. And also, when we close, we're going to ask you just stick around for just a couple of seconds, take a very quick survey. It will help us improve future webinars, so we appreciate it if you could do that. Okay, so we're ready to go to the questions. So question for you, Nick. How many KPIs are too many, and at what point is it too much to track?
Oh, okay, that's a good question, Don. And you know what? I'll bring Mary in on this one as well. I'll give my take, but it'll just be sort of my opinion. I'm actually curious, Mary, if you agree or disagree. But yeah, for me, I mean, the question of how many KPIs is too many, I'm a firm believer in less is more. And I think the whole point of having a measurement framework is to try to bring some structure and some order to what might otherwise be a pretty chaotic environment. And so, in my opinion, if you have a whole lot of KPIs, you're almost, I wouldn't say defeating the purpose, but you're not getting the same kind of clarity and structure that you could. So what I would say is, think critically, ask yourself, is this truly a key performance indicator, right? Is this indicative of performance or is it not? There's a temptation, especially for those of you that are real analytics nerds like me, you know all the different kinds of metrics that are out there, to want to invite all of those metrics into the party. And what I would say is, your measurement framework should be a bit more exclusive. I guess, to sum it up, for me, if every metric is important, that means that none of them really is. So I would say less is more. It's hard to give an exact number. Like, you should have no more than 12 KPIs. I don't want to commit to a number like that, but I would say less is more for sure, and err on the side of simplicity. But Mary, let me bring you in here and just see if you agree, disagree, or what do you think?
Yeah, I agree 100%. KPIs should be few in number, highly actionable. Now, there are many, now don't let that hold you back when you're building your KPI or your measurement framework. You can include other measurement items, support measures, deeper analytics questions that you may want to answer in the future. This also ladders very nicely in with what Nick was saying at the end of the presentation. This should be a phased approach. It's not like you're going to get every metric under the sun and every deep dive analysis wish on your first pass. That's why we talk about focused KPIs, that the most important ones being your stepping off point. So you keep those few, you keep those actionable, but as you're having discussions, as you're putting your framework together, when you come up with additional measures, we like to call them supporting metrics, or analysis questions that come up that might actually be supported by many different metrics. You enumerate those, you document those. It can actually be like a supplementary to your measurement framework that you can revisit and you can use to enhance your ongoing measurement. So a lot of those items, like I said, get phased in maybe a little bit later on once your core analytics are in place, once your core KPIs, because they in fact are the most important pieces, are well taken care of. You can expand outward to some of those deeper analysis and deep dive questions.
Okay, next question. This is for you, Mary. How often should measurement frameworks be reviewed and audited to see if they're still relevant?
Now, that can be approached in multiple ways. And if you did a full measurement framework today and we went through the entirety of the process, which again with all the stakeholder interviews can take upwards of a month or so, that's probably a stable framework to work off of for the year. Now, for me, if the state of the business is the same and when you're not having any large shifts within your organization, that's probably okay to revisit potentially a year from now. I like to refresh them at least once a year. However, if something happens mid-year, say like you're launching an entire new platform for social listening, say like Nick mentioned earlier, we may need to revisit the framework and talk about how, are there any KPIs we might gather from this whole new social listening program we're about to launch? What's the strategy behind that program? What are the core KPIs we want to measure? How do we bring that into our framework? You know, those things happen all the time. Anytime a large business impact is being realized, it should be revisited within the measurement framework. So if like status quo is being met, probably yearly is okay, but if you are seeing some big business organizational shifts, we recommend revisiting the framework at the same time.
Next question for you, Nick. How can I connect online and offline, so online and offline data, in the best way if I don't sell online?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question, and that's something that a lot of retailers are asking these days. I think, you know, the most important thing to consider there in terms of how do you bridge that gap between online data and offline data, which could be, you know, in-store data, POS data, that kind of stuff, is you want to think about, like, what are the kinds of things that you might be able to use as what we call a key to sort of join the online world and the offline world. And so if you don't sell online, one of the things that might be interesting is things like, you know, do you still have any kind of content online that requires a login to view, right? Any kind of customer-only content or members-only content or something like that. Because if you can get someone to authenticate online, what you can then do is have a much better chance of connecting that record of that person to some other kind of offline data that you have, right? So if they come into the store, maybe now you know their customer number, their customer ID, something like that, and you can join it to their online login, something like that. So the key there is really you need to have some kind of key or bridge between online and offline, and it needs to be something that you can tie back to an individual customer. So think about your online presence, think about what you're doing in the digital space and whether you can create some kind of privileged content or otherwise encourage people to authenticate or sign in online to sort of reveal themselves in terms of who they are, because that's going to be critical.
Okay, thanks. And Mary, if you have anything you want to add, just jump in, and same with you, Nick. Moving on to our next question. This one is for Mary. What are some examples of short or quick wins that you would recommend?
Well, that's a pretty open question, but I would recommend thinking about what Nick said towards the end of the presentation, which is low-hanging fruits. What can we get to today within our current existing, as we're starting to formulate our KPIs and we're going through this process. I have an example with an e-commerce client who seemed to feel like they're driving good traffic to their website, but people are getting lost. And we did a quick analysis, a quick review. Getting lost meaning like we know we want them to get to the cart and to convert. It was a very clear core KPIs. We had developed a KPI framework with them, but we keyed in on just those few items. Their website was in a bit of disarray, they were having some technical issues, and we knew tackling that would be a little too large. So we said, what are those data points we could look at today? And we saw things like PDP views, their product details page, just people weren't finding it, and then we realized there was a learn button that was conflicting with a product view button. You know, maybe putting two buttons next to each other that were taking the user away from actually going to a product and pushing them more into a learn phase where maybe they are actually ready to purchase. Something as simple as that, which we could key in. We only had a couple core KPIs. We only had a couple data points we were really assured were coming in validly. We ignored a lot of those, you know, technical long-term implementation pieces, which would get us to like deeper learnings later, and it said like, here's an easy one, remove the learn now button, you know, focus people on the task at hand, which is getting to the product details. And something as simple as that with just, again, a handful of KPIs, a handful of data points that we were assured were correct given the state of their web analytics, we were able to get them to a quick win optimization. And when you do things like that, and they sound simple, but they aren't always obvious to everybody. And when you have the data to support it, it really helps the business feel relieved. And they say, oh, okay, yes, the data supports this, let's keep going, let's keep chipping away at that. And that's where you can really get the wind in your sails. You can get more support for some of those, you know, maybe larger technical implementations you want to do, or maybe a new tool that you need. So biting off those smaller pieces, I think, in any way that you can, using the data at hand, is probably the best way to get a few quick wins and to get the organization behind you so you can do those larger data element pieces that you may want to do as the outcome of a larger KPI framework development. So I hope that helps. I know it's a very specific example, but if anyone else needs any others, just raise your hand.
Okay, question for you, Nick. How does the KPI framework differ between business to business and business to consumer companies?
Okay, that's a good question. The two things that I guess spring to mind for me immediately are that I don't know that the framework itself necessarily is that different, but I think that the length of time that it takes for one customer to go through that journey can become much longer than a typical sort of B2C customer journey, right? So you think about a typical B2C customer journey for some kind of product that's not, super big investment on the part of the consumer. The length of time that I'm going to sort of consider that purchase before I make it is fairly limited. On the other hand, if I'm a business and I'm deciding on whether I want to invest in building a new plant or a new data center or something like that, and I'm going to be investing multi-millions of dollars, that process is going to take a lot longer. The other thing is that the outcomes of that process are probably less likely to happen online. So very rarely in the B2B world, just using my example of, you're going to build a new factory or build a new data center, you don't add a factory to your shopping cart and check out, right? That's going to happen through sales reps and over the phone and in person and all that kind of stuff. And so I think the other key difference in the B2B world is that you're going to have to be prepared to retrieve data from potentially more sources, more silos than you do in the B2C world, right? So if you're a B2C retailer and your whole business is online, something as simple as like web analytics might be all that you need to have a true sort of end-to-end view of your customer's activity online. But measuring that customer journey in the B2B space, right, if all you have is your website analytics, you're going to have major blind spots. So I still think that you can take your business objectives and organize them through the lens of what that customer journey looks like, and that's why I say I don't think the framework itself necessarily changes that much, but the length of time that it takes to go from beginning to end and the environment where some of those outcomes are happening often look different, and that does have some implications.
All right, next question. What's the best way to get started with a framework and sell it to the C-suite? Nick, why don't you start, and Mary can jump in if she has any thoughts.
Yeah, that's a good question. So to me, if you want to get started with a KPI framework, you obviously need to sort of convince the relevant folks in the organization that it's necessary and that it's going to create some value. And I hope this isn't too, playful of an answer, but I mean, what I would say is, if you're having trouble selling a measurement framework within the organization, I would have a very frank conversation with the relevant folks about, how much ROI you're deriving from analytics already, right? Are you getting what you want in terms of taking all that raw data and turning it into actionable insight with clear next steps against specific audience groups that you can activate? If you are, right, if you're already doing that to your satisfaction, then perhaps you don't need a KPI framework. But I think, as some of that survey data showed at the beginning, very often that's not the case. And so I don't mean to give kind of a joke as an answer, but what I would say is, ask yourself as an organization critically, are we getting the kind of value that we want to be getting from all of our data and from our analytics efforts? And if you find that when you look in the mirror, you're not getting the value that you want, that I think is sort of the best single sales pitch for developing a measurement framework, which you can then use to build your analytics initiatives on in the future.
And actually, I have a tactical selling point, which is what Nick started this whole presentation with, which is we're drowning in data today. To find a single source of data truth which can really move your business requires more attention to detail than ever before. And so again, the investment in that is not trivial, and it's not a quick turnaround task, but if we don't actually define, and we've talked about some examples where not defining your terms, not being ultimately specific and clear and communicative across your organization about what these metrics mean, you're going to have different people pulling different insights, and I use the term insights loosely. It could be a completely incorrect insight because they don't know how to use their data. They don't even know how their terms are defined. So it's almost, it's to me, that's the key selling point. In a world where we have massive amounts of data, we need all of us to align on single source of data truth within our organizations in order to move the needle forward together as an organization, so we don't have two different people in the same team viewing data in different ways and going in totally opposite directions. And like that goes back to what you were saying about impacting ROI ultimately. So to me, that's just a simple selling point.
Okay, we're pretty much at the top of the hour, so we're going to wrap up this webinar. I want to thank Mary Ann Andrews and Nick Iyengar from Cardinal Path for their presentations, and thank you all for attending and for your questions. If you could stick around for just a few seconds for a quick survey, that would be really helpful. And that wraps up today's discussion, so thanks again and have a great day.